Make a motion to approve this. All in favor?
Passes. Go ahead, education on theirs up.
Yes, sir, I'd like to call the education committee to order. You have a set of minutes before you. I hope you've had an opportunity to.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
All those in favor? Thank you. Call me to order.
And we're here today just to go over the general purpose budget. He's gonna go through the stuff he went over last week. And he's just gonna let everybody know what's going on, if there's any questions, everyone can ask. After that, it's gonna give us a week to sit there and look over everything. Just think about everything that's been submitted. We're gonna come back next Monday at 6 p.m. before our regular scheduled meeting. And if we're ready at that time, we're gonna go ahead and approve the needs at that time for that. And then we'll go into our budget, and then as we are going through all the money, then we will make the decisions as far as how we're gonna proceed from there.
Actually, we will just accept the budgets next Monday night, and then we won't approve needs until budget committee meets on July 30th.
Okay. All right, Nikki?
Thank you, sir. For those that did not get to come last week, for whatever reason, I hope you were able to pick your book up. You should have got one in the mail or through the mayor's office, one or the other. So if you didn't get that, let me know, but I hope everybody got one. In the book, for those of you that wasn't here, the needs assessment are in there, our digital conversion plan, our salary schedules along with the benefit schedule, and then the what I call the smaller budgets, the school federal projects budget, the central cafeteria budget, the extended school budget, and the education capital projects budget. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because we've already been through those with the committee. We have an event over at the office with our principals. I noticed Mr. Marlowe here. He must have stepped out early. Or was it over? So we're waiting on Dr. Wright. Dr. Wright will be here in just a minute, but she had an event for the administrators, so she's at that. In the general purpose school fund tab that you have in front of you, something I wanted to mention is there's 3 different times we tell you what's new in the budget from one year to the other. There's a memo in front of the budget, there's a budget, and then there's a running total sheet in the back of the budget. So if you could turn to your sheet that says page 1 of the budget, it's going to start with the revenue section of the budget. We'll start there. As this budget's put together, I estimated roughly a 3% growth. I know it's more than that. I think I'm waiting on us to finalize that final growth number, but I know it's more than 3% simply because you're having to do a 1.5% raise for the county employees. So I think that's a test. I'm looking at Aaron back there. He's shaking his head. That's the test that you all use for the county employee side and the highway fund, I think, to do that raise with. So I know this 3% is going to go up, and I'll continue to work with Aaron as that number gets closer to being finalized to change that number. We've estimated a 5% growth in sales tax. We've been around 5.1 to 5.3% for the last several years. So I have a 5% growth in sales tax. On the second page, our number from the state, it's up about $2.7 million from the state BEP, and our growth numbers for this coming year and what we anticipate in growth factors for that. The Safe Schools money is coming a little bit different for our county compared to what it did last year. If you remember last year in the governor's budget, he gave us some one-time money. Now everything for us is recurring money because they're focusing across the state on SROs and schools. So we will get some recurring money to do some things with there, and I'll show you in a minute where those funds are. You will notice that in 47,590 other federal through state, we lost a Youth Links grant that we've had for probably 16 to 17 years in our county. We lost that grant, but we picked up a pipeline grant, and that's a grant where we can start training staff to be administrators. So you'll notice in that line item, it went from 400 down to 104,000, and that's why that line item there changed. If you look over on the last page there, you'll see a new operating transfer sheet in there of $221,666. For those of you that were at the last week or at the education meetings earlier on school federal projects, that money is coming from the school federal projects fund into the general purpose school fund as a transfer, and I'll show you what that money where that money's at in the budget when I get to the expenditure line item. On page 4 is our big section of the general purpose school fund budget. This is where we pay for most of our teaching staff from. In this particular section, we have 15 teachers in here for growth, 7 new teachers for elementary and middle school, and the reason that's broken out, those were already hired. We have 13 new teachers for Gladeville Middle, a new teacher assistant for Gladeville Middle. Textbooks, we haven't adopted textbooks, a new adoption in 7 years. That's because of the state. So there's an increase in textbooks. Our safety grant, we realigned some of our safety grant money because now it's recurring money. And what we did with that is we added more time and more money to our STARS contract to put STARS in our middle schools. STARS is a counseling program. It's not a prevention program. It's a counseling program. So we're adding more time in the middle school to try to help our counselors there. Also from the, yes, sir.
Excuse me just a second, the teacher pay plan, say 15 new teachers for growth, 7, 13, and 1, are those separate numbers?
Yes.
Not included in the other?
No, that's all new things in this section.
7 plus 13 plus 1, correct?
Well, and then 7 more that we're fixing to talk about.
Right, exactly.
So.
Thank you.
So then there's 7 other teachers that were moved from school federal projects. If you remember when we did school federal projects, we had to set aside a part of money for a disproportionate issue. Those 7 teachers are in this section of the budget. And then if you remember, we talked about an academy and we were pushing, instead of having MAP, we're going to have a learning academy with an alternative program under it and a virtual school program on it. So those teachers and those teacher assistants are also moved to this section of the budget. When you look to the next sheet, you'll see that that section of the budget went to 0 for the alternative school. We're still using it. It's just we're going to make a better use of the Learning Academy and use that for when kids get assigned or enrolled in the Learning Academy. If they need the alternative section, they'll get it. If they need the virtual section, they will get that. So we have some high-level kids making some bad decisions. But we still need to take care of them academically, and the virtual school option is going to let us take care of both sets of kids at the Learning Academy, and the Learning Academy can actually graduate from there. So on the next page, you'll see that the 71,150 section that went to 0 because those expenses have been moved to 71,100, and then the guidance counselor has been moved down to a different section, 72,130, and I'll show you where that's at here in just a second. In the special ed section of the budget, 71,200 category, we have a new special ed teacher and a new speech language pathologist, and then 2 new teacher assistants in this section of the budget for our special education area of the budget. The next page is our vocational or career technical education. Sorry, I'm still used to calling it vocational education, career technical education. There's not any changes here other than teachers are getting their performance levels. And throughout the budget, the teachers are getting their performance levels and the support staff are moving on the salary schedule as appropriate throughout the budget. The other thing for certified staff is our certified retirement rate went from 10.46 to 10.63%. So that's throughout the budget on the benefit side. Under the attendance section, we don't have any changes there. Under the health services, we do have a new nurse for Gladeville Middle School in that section of the budget for a nurse for the middle school. On page 9, under the guidance section, we have a counselor for Gladeville Middle School, Watertown High School. If you remembered, I told you the counselor from MAP moved to this section of the budget. And then we have a new counseling coordinator that's reimbursed from IDEA and a new academic effectiveness supervisor also reimbursed from IDEA, and that's that $221,666 we talked about earlier. That's on the operating revenue side. Page 10, under regular instruction, for the past couple of years, we've used the retirement portion that we have put in the insurance fund to balance our budget. I'm requesting that be put back in our budget. You'll see that in line item 299. And then there's a new librarian in here for Gladeville Middle School. On page 11, you'll notice that the 72,215 section of the alternative school, though that principal and secretary's salaries and benefits have been moved down to the schools because now they're operating as a school. They're no longer just a program. Under the special ed section of this part of the budget, there's a new psychologist for growth, and a new academic success coordinator, and a new student services coordinator in this section of the budget. Page 12, under technology, all of our software renewals that we use to run the district and all the programs we do for our staff and our kids, that our software renewals are up. And we also have a new database administrator we're putting in the budget because we're so data rich. We need help in supporting that we get out to our teachers, and we need another person to help us do that. We have one right now. We really need two as a backup, because one person knowing everything, if they leave us or whatever, that puts us in a bind where you need somebody to also be there and back up so we can make the data more available and richer for our staff in what they do on a daily basis. On page 13 under the Board of Education, the only note there is the note that they are members of NSBA and TSBA and TOS. We have to state that for the public, that those groups are lobbying groups, just like your County Commissioners Association is, but there's a law that the board has to state that they do lobbying activities on their behalf. On page 14, there's not any changes under the Office of the Superintendent. Under the Office of the Principal, we have another assistant principal, Glayville Middle. If you remember in last year's budget, we hired one AP half of the year, so they're already in the budget. We give them additional assistant principal, a new clerical for guidance at Glayville Middle, a new registrar for Glayville Middle, and then the MAP alternative program principal and secretary moved to this section of the budget, and then there's a new registrar for the Learning Academy. The reason there's a registrar for the Learning Academy, what happens now if they get assigned a MAP, it's just an assignment. When the Learning Academy happens, they're actually going unenroll at that school they came from, and they'll enroll in the Learning Academy. So they won't be a home school now. They'll actually be in a Learning Academy. So those are the changes in this particular section of the budget under the Office of the Principal. There's not any changes from last year's budget to next year's budget in finance or HR. On page 17, under maintenance of plant, the big changes here are the utilities and cleaning services for Glayville Middle School. We didn't have it until this year, so we are now paying those bills for cleaning and the utilities. No changes in maintenance. Under transportation, we've had more drivers qualify for medical insurance. Every year, as we add more hours to different drivers, they get to qualify for medical insurance, so that line item's up. And then we had an increase in the vehicle insurance line item. Under community services, you'll notice that everything with Youth Links in a bracket went to zero because we lost the grant, we lost the revenue, we lost the expenditures on this particular page. So that's the change on this section. On page 21, under the early childhood part, that's some people call it a voluntary pre-K, some people call it a lottery pre-K. Either way, it's okay. It's not a special ed pre-K, but it is a volunteer pre-K program. There's no changes there. If you notice under the one that's labeled out there in the middle that says Safe Schools Grant, you'll notice that's down some. The reason that's down is we moved that money over to STARS to pay for more counseling for the middle school students.
Mickey,
Yes, ma'am.
and this is just an odd question, but being on Health and Welfare Committee this year, when they presented their budgets to us, they each had to present a budget, and I noticed that STARS applied for us. So y'all give them $196,000 plus a year to operate in the school system?
Yes, ma'am.
And how much is any of that? Is any of that federally funded or anything as well, or state funded, or?
I think all of it, but 75,000 is coming through a grant. We're using our Safe Schools grant to do that, and then we're funding the rest of it locally because that service is very valuable to the middle school students and the high school students to support our other counselors. Also, if we have a situation that occurs where someone dies or someone is in a wreck or something like that happens, they also provide that extra support for our staff and our students. Grief counseling, if we need them to do that. If we have someone in trouble, they'll go do a home visit for us if we need to do that. One of the examples I used the other night was Wes Wilson had a situation where someone pulled up in their parking lot, had a tragic accident. They're helping us with that employee that found that person to talk through that, how to handle it, and those kinds of things. So they do that for us very well.
Sarah, also that's happening too, they're also acting as mental health counselors because school counselors, guidance counselors as we used to call them, are not trained. That is not an expectation of their job. And so when you see what's happening,
Particularly with younger and younger children, they are able, STAR counselors are able to come in and provide that assistance. And particularly when you have what they call the mobile crisis unit, we'll have children that will have meltdowns, and these are the first-hand people that we call because they're trained in mental health. And it's a service that we couldn't provide otherwise, and it's, I don't want to use discounted, but it's very much a cost savings. Many of our families do not have insurance that will cover mental health care, and for those that do, it more or less runs out. I believe it's in 9 months, isn't it, Nikki, as far as family coverage for health service. So we are the gap for many because the kids have to return to school and they're in desperate need of mental health services. And I don't know if you said, maybe we've had this in high school, now we're rolling it down into middle schools.
So will there be if you had it in high schools, there'll be an additional.
Yes, that's where the increase, that's the reason it increased. Down toward the bottom, you'll see $235,000 as principal and bonds. The board is asking take their mixed drink proceeds and let them apply that to a bond to build 3 facilities at the high schools, Watertown, Lebanon, and Wilson Central, that do not have what Mount Juliet has or Green Hill has. And also, we've got some serious issues with the track at Mount Juliet High School, and also to redo the 4 tennis courts. So they're asking if you all would allow them to take that revenue and let it pay for a bond over 20 years. Preliminary estimates are it would generate $3.7 million to do that, and we would send the money over to Aaron like we do on the other debt to pay for that if the county commission would approve that. And then I'll open that up to some questions if anyone has questions.
I think I do have a question or two. It's been brought to my attention a number of times about you have several deputy directors in here. I think if I'm not mistaken, I counted maybe 4 or 5. Could you please explain each deputy director and where they may have come from or why it's such as it is?
Well, we do have 5. We talked about this Tuesday night. That question came up. My position was created under Dr. Duncan in 2004, 2005. Back then, when Dr. Sutherland came in, he created 3 more. He converted the HR supervisor to a deputy director of talent, which is HR. That's still here. He created a deputy director of academics, which is still here. And he also created a deputy director of student services. If you go back and look at Budget Amendment 2014-02, that was a budget amendment that was passed by the board and this county commission when those positions were brought forward by Dr. Sutherland back then and was approved. And then when Dr. Wright came in, we had a person that was a supervisor of accountability, and she elevated that position to a deputy director of accountability. It's not a brand new position. It was just an elevated position in the budget. So those are the 5 that are in the school district.
So they're already in the budget. It's not something new you added. So are any of these attorneys?
Our deputy director for talent, we may have changed that title, but for HR, yes. And the one for student services is.
So we're using them as a dual, so to speak, a dual role.
Well, I don't think it was advertised that way, but we ended up being able to bring an attorney on staff to take those positions.
Thank you.
Now, do they actually act as attorneys for the school board at this time, or what?
We do use their legal background. Yes, sir, we do. Yes, sir.
No question. As far as the SRO officers, that they're kind of assisting all the counties in their state that has not had a program before, is that going to open up any money for us as far as for paying for anything or?
Well, we've got some left in there that we're working on, either going more access controls or looking at cameras that are weak right now, trying to work on those. We work with the current SROs. We've been fortunate in our county for a long time to have a good SRO program, very valuable to our schools and our community for safety. County Commission has been very gracious in how they've funded that for us and having something in every school, where a lot of schools don't even have one. So with your help, we've been very fortunate to be well covered in our schools, in our opinion.
My question was, the money that's given out, the state's giving out money to these districts that currently doesn't have SROs.
My understanding of we've got a webinar in 2 weeks, I think it's coming out on that, but our understanding is the priority will be given to school districts. They would be awarded more points based on if they do not have one, is what I understand, and Commissioner Ash may have.
Stressed counties are gonna get the first bite at that.
That's the way we understand the information we've seen so far. They would get it first, and then, but we still are getting some.
Offer any money to those that already bit the bullet years ago.
You know, there is something in that formula that works a little bit toward helping folks like us in Williamson and Rutherford, but it's, in the big scheme of the money's just gonna come in, it's not gonna be that much right now.
Any amount we get be nice, so Sheriff.
Look
Well,
at
I
what's
mean-
also circulating among superintendents as far as across the state. They're doing comparisons right now and
Unfortunately, sort of like what Commissioner Ash referred to as distressed districts. They're fortunate if they have one, but they're paying for it out of their own funds, which again, for those small districts, that's hard to come by. And so what they're doing, it's almost like a weighted, and Commissioner, correct me on this, they're gonna weight it, and for those districts that already have in-house, and where you are more than fortunate, if we get anything, it'll be minimal. And that's what's circulating among superintendents right now.
The one thing that we talked about the other night sort of goes along with what Commissioner Ash just said is our county's ability to pay continually goes up every year, or it has so far. So like this year, it's jumping to 2.5. Last year it was 2.05. Like Williamson Metro is like 4 plus, closer to 5 like in Metro. As that number goes up, even though we're growing, the amount you're going to get from the state is not going to be those big increases. If everybody remembers when BEP was created in the mid-90s, we were getting $4, $5, $6 million. Now we're down to 2.7. And we talked about this example the other night with Hancock County. The state's funded probably 96, 97% of that school district because of their ability to pay. And that's one of the poorest counties in the state, where if you look at Rutherford and Williamson, they're about 50-50 from the state and here. I know when I started, we were around 75, 76% with the state. Now we're down to 65. So that's going to continue a trend, and that's the economics behind the BEP formula from the way the state does it. So when the governor says they're doing something, and if they say it's going to be in the BEP formula, we're not going to get all that kind of money like some other districts may get because of our ability to pay. So we talked about it. The question came up the other night about the 3% raise that the governor talked about, for example. He has very good speechwriters. So they are technically correct in what they said. They just didn't tell you the rest of the story. It's good to say there's a 3% raise on the minimum salary schedule for the state. There's only 2 districts that we're aware of in the state that's on the minimum salary schedule. But they don't go ahead and tell you it's going to be put over in the BEP formula. So when that happens, that 3% might come down to 0.75 or 0.8% for us in the actual dollars we get. But we have 200 teachers above what's funded in BEP. We get nothing from them for the state. So that number drops down even more. So they're technically not wrong in the state of speech. They just don't tell the rest of the story when it goes into BEP, what happens, how that money funnels down to a county.
Have y'all been doing the education to the teachers and letting them know that even though the governor's saying
Every year after the state of the state, we have to answer a lot of text messages and emails. Yes, sir.
Because they've already calculated what they've heard on the news as far as, and then we answer that, and it's every year.
The other thing we do in relation to your question, Commissioner Glover, is every September, once all the teachers are hired and they're in place, they're going to get a sheet that says, hey, my salary was this last year. Here's my new performance level. Here's my new salary for this year. They will get that in about 6 weeks. I think Commissioner Bannock can attest to that. So we send that out to every staff member so they know exactly what they're getting. What you hear from some teachers is they're trying to compare a W-2 to their salary. Now, W-2 is not your salary. Plus, our salary is on fiscal year basis. W-2 is on a calendar year basis. So you got to look at it that way. But if you do get a question, and I know some of you have been getting questions from teachers, ask them to call us, or we'll share that information. A lot of you have it anyway through the open records request, so you've got their salaries anyway. But that's how we tell teachers what they're getting. I answer those questions a lot for the board members and some of you all that get questions about teacher pay.
And
we'll be happy to
explain also the part where I guess a new teacher coming in, Dr. Wright and I talked about it some, just kind of explain it to some of the other commissioners, because I'm sure they're going to be getting questions about that same exact thing.
Yeah, if you look at we've always had a placement schedule since 2014. That's not new. We did make some adjustments in it this year, but the placement schedule says if you're coming in here from, say, Shelby County or out of state, this is where you're going to fall on our salary schedule. This is how you come in the door. This is your year one salary. So if you've got 5 years experience, 10 years experience, or whatever, that's where you're going to be placed. I actually have 1,300 different salary schedules for teachers. Because if all of you are our teachers, each one of you can make a different salary based on whether you're a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 teacher. So that's why we send the sheets out every September to tell them that. But none of our teachers will make less than the placement schedule. If we do any adjustments in the placement schedule, we look at that and test that, make sure we don't have anybody making less than that schedule. If they're making less than that schedule, we'll catch them up, but it probably means they're not a level 3, 4, or 5 teacher in the years past.
Advanced degrees also are calculated in there as well, because that becomes, and I know there was some confusion with teachers, I guess it was 2 years ago, that they were looking over it there and saying, oh, I'm certainly not making that, but what they were doing, they had moved over, they were sitting on a bachelor's and did not have a master's or anything above a master's.
Other questions? I would like to say, for those of you that came last week, your attendance exceeded our expectations, so I appreciate you all coming. We counted 18 that came in the 2 days, which was great. I know some of you were out of town and couldn't come, but you asked a lot of good questions last week. I just want to say thank you for doing that. If you have any questions after we finish, I mean, I'll stay here as long as you need me to, but if you have any questions, call me. Come by the office and we'll go over it line by line if you need to. Yes, sir.
I've got a question on the red on the first page. It says the amount of fund balance used to fund recurring items is, I guess, is 4.8 million.
Yes, sir.
What does that mean? What are you telling me?
What I tell, and I've been telling you all for several years. That's a cover your rear end number for me. Tells you that our revenues are short by that much money and we're using that much of fund balance.
Right?
If you remember, well, we're not short, but our revenues don't equal expenditures. And if you remember, up until about 3 years ago, you always had that situation in the general fund. And you all made some decisions and corrected that, where your fund balance got up high and your revenues and expenditures, I think, in 18, if I remember Aaron's presentation correct, was the first time it had equaled. Was that correct, Aaron?
It might have been the year before that, but I can't recall for sure, Mickey.
So I'm telling you that because that's something on our needs assessment we would love to have where we didn't have taken it out of our fund balance
That is actually your fund balance.
that we're using to balance the
Funding
budget.
That portion, correct?
Yes, we're taking that out of fund balance to balance the budget.
Versus the 3.6,
Correct.
which is, could you explain that?
The 3.6 is the board can't send over an unbalanced budget to you all. So the 3.6, as we talked about Monday and Tuesday, is an amount that I need to sit down and talk to Mr. Maynard about and the mayor to get the final budget and walking through this process as a budget process. It's something we normally do every year. We've got to make up somehow, whether the board has to do cuts or we get more money. That's going to go down a little bit because I know the growth is more than 3%. So that number is going to go down by whatever that number is. And so those are things that just will evolve over the next few
That much
weeks.
Money, or you have to cut something, correct?
Yes, sir.
That notation, that, again, that's been something that Mickey's provided on that summary sheet, really for the last 3 to 4 years, just as a reminder.
Right, I understand. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Executive Director?
Thank
No
you.
more questions. We're gonna go ahead and recess our budget meeting until Monday night, and we will start it back then. Is education gonna do the same thing?
Yes. Education do the same thing. We'll recess until Monday night prior to the regular county commission meeting.